On 1+1, defending a man who's reviled by his people, the voice behind Sting, and from dyslexic kid to one of our top female scientists. Hello, I'm Jane Hutchin. Welcome to the programme. As one of the UK's leading criminal barristers, Courtenay Griffiths has made it his life's work defending those accused of serious crime. But after 15 years, he found himself on a depressing treadmill, watching a lot of young men go to prison for long stretches. So when the chance to defend one of Africa's most notorious warlords came up, he says it was a relief. That client is Liberia's former president, Charles Taylor, who's on trial at The Hague for crimes against humanity. Courtenay Griffiths is speaking with Philip Williams in London.
Well, Courtenay Griffiths, welcome to 1+1.
And thank you for having me.
Your name conjures up courtroom drama and protecting the bad guys. Are both those images correct, or where am I wrong with that assessment?
Well, you're wrong to the extent that I don't live on a, diet of bad guys, because as far as I'm concerned, everyone is innocent until proven guilty. So to prejudge the issue really isn't something that I approve of.
That was a presumption on my part then. But you, when you're in the courtroom, you don't hold back, you're quite dramatic, and you're very forceful. Where did you learn those arts, and how important do you think is that personality behind the persuasive arguments that you're driving?
Well, I think that advocacy of any form has to be informed by the personality of the advocate. And that's part of my personality, that if I'm asking you a question, I want you to give me an answer. And if you persist in trying to evade an obvious answer, I will be equally persistent in pursuing you. Did you have a blood diamond party in your offices last Friday night? So, how do you know he might have agreed? Simple question.
I don't know.
So why did you tell the judges that a few minutes ago, if you don't know?
Well,
Are you in the habit of saying things you don't know about?
You look like you're enjoying it, I must say.
Well, I may well look like I'm enjoying it, but people don't seem to realise that in a situation like that, as an advocate, you get into a zone. It's you and this individual. And you try and cut out, to some extent, what is going on around you, because you're listening to the answers, you're concentrating on the facial expressions, the body language of the individual, because all of those provide you clues as to the next question you're going to ask. And also, to an extent, because advocacy is a performing art, yes, you are performing. And you know when you're performing well, and you know when you're having an effect. And of course that's enjoyable, because that's the nature of my job. That's what I'm being paid to do.
Now, Charles Taylor is regarded by many as the devil incarnate, as having committed horrendous crimes against his own people. Now, without prejudging whether that is a correct assessment of him, how do you cope with defending people that the majority of the population regard as bad, as evil even?
I've never had a problem with that, Philip, and the reason why I don't have a problem with it is this. At the end of the day, as an advocate, I'm there to present an argument on behalf of a defendant. The prosecution are there to present their case. At the end of the day, it's either the judge or the jury who bring out a verdict of guilt or innocence.
And yet, are there times when you've thought your client was guilty, but they've got off?
As an advocate, of course, you look with experienced eyes at the evidence before you, and you may have doubts about the accuracy and truthfulness of the instructions you're receiving from your client. But at the end of the day, it's not your job to go in court and declare this person guilty. Your job is to defend, and so consequently, it would be quite wrong for me to be making final judgments as to the innocence or guilt of any person I defend.
What is it in your background, do you think, that has made you such a high profile, got you where you are today, and got you the sort of attention of so many people over the last few years?
Well, as a boy growing up primarily in the United Kingdom, because I was born in Jamaica, but I came to the UK when I was 5 years old, and I effectively grew up here. I'm an Englishman, I'm a POM. But at the end of the day, you know, growing up as a young black boy in England, at that time in the 1960s and 70s, we had to confront a great deal of racism, much of it directed at us by the police and the system of criminal justice here in the United Kingdom. And I was adamant that I would like to take the struggles that we necessarily had for equality in the 60s into the courtroom.
When you were being picked up by police as a youngster, unfairly so, because you were black, did that ingrain an anger in the system? I mean, in the system of so-called justice for you?
Yes, there was a sense of anger. But I must say that over the years, particularly since I started to sit as a part-time judge, that I've mellowed somewhat, and I've now become able to see both sides of the story. And I can see that, for example, the vast majority of policemen today try their best to do what is an extremely difficult job, and the vast majority of them do it well. But as an institution, I still have certain problems with the police, because when you look at statistics, for example, that young black youngsters are still statistically much more likely to be stopped and searched by the police, you have to ask, why is that at the beginning of the 21st century?
Does that reflect prejudice?
Yes, it does. And more than prejudice, it reflects the racism in those societies. And my concern, now that I'm operating in the area of international criminal law, that we could well be replicating those attitudes at an international level. Because currently, every single person indicted before the International Criminal Court is from, guess where? Africa. And that concerns me.
You're saying that the basis of it is racism?
I think, as currently operated, yes.
That's a pretty serious conclusion to reach for an international court, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And I think it's a correct one, because one has to ask oneself, are conflicts limited to the African continent? Why, for example, is there not a global uproar about the fact of what Israel did in Gaza a couple of years ago, using illegal weapons? We all know, for example, that the war in Iraq was illegal. Do you honestly think, Philip, there's ever going to be a prospect of a Tony Blair or George Bush being put on trial? You and I know it's never going to happen, because international criminal law, as currently practiced, places certain powerful countries above the law, and I don't accept that.
Isn't that more international politics rather than institutionalised racism?
Well, I think the two are intertwined. I think the two are intertwined, and I'll be quite blunt with you. As far as I'm concerned, international criminal law now is being used on the African continent as a neo-colonialist tool. That is my firm belief.
How do Western nations subjugate African nations through the court system? How does that work?
Well, it works in this way, by indicting a Charles Taylor, who was very unpopular with the West. And the clear message is, if you step out of line, if you don't toe our line, we will brand you a criminal.
Unfairly? Unfairly. What about the victims in these cases, though? How do you feel about their positions in all of these difficult cases?
I am concerned about the victims, Philip, but I think we need to put this in some kind of context. You have to realise that the wars which are plaguing Africa now are part of a seismic social change which is taking place in all of those societies.
But that in no way forgives bad behaviour, does it?
No,
or evil behaviour.
But at the same time, we forget our history. Because every society which has experienced those kind of seismic social changes, it has always been attended by violence. The English Civil War, the French Revolution, the American Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s in the United States, all attended by violence. And at those times, the crimes committed, for example, when Cromwell slaughtered thousands of Irishmen at Drogheda and Wexford, they weren't regarded as atrocities then. But now, as Africa is going through the convulsions of this social change, we now have that change being criminalised, and I have a difficulty with that.
But surely, we're talking about historic events 300-400 years ago. We have a legal system now, it's very clear-cut, and it says these sorts of crimes are not acceptable and should not be allowed, and that people should be prosecuted. Isn't that the simple reality?
But you see, it's part of the hypocrisy which I suggest is at the heart of international criminal justice. Because when, for example, dictators favourable to the West were committing such atrocities in Africa, Mobutu, Bokassa, Verwoerd, Vorster, no complaints whatever from this West wedded to the idea of humanitarian needs and so on.
Selective outrage.
Selective outrage.
You absolutely convinced of the innocence of your client?
Yes, I am. So far as Charles Taylor and Sierra Leone is concerned, I do not accept that the prosecution have produced sufficient evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he was responsible for the atrocities in that country. What happened in Liberia, the country which he was president of, is a different matter altogether, but he's not on trial for that.
You attract international attention now. You have journalists lining up at your door to do interviews like me. Who keeps you grounded?
My wife and family.
And what do they tell you?
Well, I'm the king in this house, not you.
Okay. On that note, thanks very much for talking to 1+1.
Thank you, Philip.
Dr Cathy Foley is one of Australia's top scientists and the Deputy Chief of Science at the CSIRO. It's a far cry from the dyslexic schoolgirl who couldn't write or spell properly but loved her maths and physics. Last year, she added a Telstra Business Award to her long list of achievements, and she believes that scientists need to talk and promote their work more widely. Cathy Foley, welcome to 1+1.
My pleasure.
How did you first get interested in science?